Hey guys, welcome back to our series of lessons on real talk between parents and teenagers. And let's face it, sometimes it's hard just to have the conversation. And my biggest goal in doing these Bible studies is just to fertilize conversation, that parents and teens would talk, not yell, would listen, and not just over talk each other. And I'm hoping that today we can do that. We can fertilize some more good conversation. I want to talk today about boundaries. Boundaries, rules, fences, expectations. There's a whole bunch of different words I guess we could use, but I've chosen the word boundary because it's a very biblical topic, the topic of boundaries. We find it all throughout the Old Testament, how that God set people within certain boundaries, how that He was very, very specific about here's how far you can go. Don't go over there. Stay within this place of safety. Don't move the landmark. Don't change the boundary. So there's a whole lot in the Bible about boundaries. And in order for us maybe to make this lesson a little bit more practical, it might be good to just pause this video here in just a moment and just make a list. Just as a group tonight watching this, make a list of what are some areas between parents and teenagers that we typically set boundaries. I was thinking about just my own kids growing up and the boundaries that we had. We had boundaries about curfew, what time they were allowed to be home by. We had boundaries about what was acceptable to watch on television, how much television was acceptable to watch. We didn't have the internet back in those days to police, but screen time in general. Our kids didn't have cell phones, and so it was easier to parent back in those days. But boundaries about cell phones and cell phone usage and devices in general. Boundaries about friendship or about relationships with the members of the opposite sex, when to date, when not to date. Boundaries about using the automobile. I mean, there are any number of areas where we have boundaries, we set boundaries, and where teenagers are maybe even expecting boundaries. So why don't you take a moment just now, hit pause, and just talk about, maybe make a list as a group, make a list of 10 or 15 things that are the common areas where we have boundaries. And teens, you help out. You know, what are the rules that mom and dad have? And let's talk about them. Let's talk about why we should have them, when they should go away, if ever. What do boundaries imply? What does the Bible say about them? We'll talk about all of that in just a moment. So hit pause, and we'll see you here back in a moment. Well, welcome back. If indeed you did pause the video, if not, thanks for watching still. Let me give you 5 statements. We talk about 5 essential truths about boundaries when it comes to parents and teenagers. Number 1, boundaries define safety and respect. They define safety and respect. So in the Bible, when God set boundaries for the various tribes or for the nation itself, it was all about what God had for them within those boundaries. Too often we think about boundaries as something that keeps us away from something that might be enjoyable or horizons that we want to explore. But boundaries in the Bible, the purpose of them was that we might more fully enjoy what's inside of them. And so it's really a paradigm shift, a change in our thinking when it comes to why do boundaries exist. They exist for safety and for respect. So let me give you 3 words to keep in mind when it comes to the safety that boundaries provide or the respect that they ought to engender. Okay, number 1, clarity. When it comes to boundaries, people need to know what they are. Your teenager needs to know explicitly what is the rule, what is the expectation, what time am I supposed to be home, the what of the boundary. Sometimes if we're not careful, parents, we're not clear, and we only get clear when they do something we don't want them to do, and then all of a sudden, we yell this expectation that wasn't clear in the first place. So it's very important that we define the boundary. In the Bible, the boundaries were very explicitly given. It's this river, it's that mountain range, it's this landmark. They were clear. The what was very clear. But not only the what of the boundary, the why of the boundary. Why do we have this rule? Why is it important that we guard what we're watching on our cell phone, or why we have Covenant Eyes, and why do we have why do we have 360 on our phones? We know where our kids are at all times. Are my parents just being the Gestapo? I mean, what's the reason behind this? Why do I have to be home by 10? Why can't we watch that movie? I mean, there are all kinds of whys, and we need to be able to have some categorical answers as to why that's true. So clarity. But not only the word clarity, I think the word consistency. Boundaries are only effective as we consistently point to them, as we consistently outline them, as we walk the edge of our property and say, this is the property line. Or to use another illustration, boundaries are only meaningful as we enforce them. If I have a don't go past this line, and yet it doesn't mean anything, they go past that line anyway, then really at the end of the day, boundaries are only effective if we enforce them. I've said it this way: laws aren't laws. Enforcement is law. And I'll give you a great example. You drive on Interstate 95, everyone's going to go 75, 80 miles an hour, and no one's going to worry about it. You can drive right by a police officer. Why? Because even though the speed limit says 65, everybody knows you're never going to be stopped unless you're going like 85. So people find what the real boundary is. And the real boundary in your family is not what's stated. It's not the rule that you have. It's what you enforce consistently. I can take you to places in West Virginia, Somerville, where you travel through, and when it says 55, you do 55. Why? Because if you're doing 57, they will stop you because they're consistent in their enforcement, and people obey the law. Why? It's enforced. Sure, there ought to be clarity, there ought to be consistency, but then I would say thirdly, there needs to be mutual respect, both in the giving of boundaries. We don't treat teenagers like they're 3, but also in the receiving of boundaries, in the way that we even enforce them. We expect for a police officer, when they pull us over on the side of the road, to be respectful, even though I was speeding, even though I need to give my license and registration, even though I'm going to receive that warning or that ticket, we still expect that the authority is going to be respectful to me as a human being. And that ought to be true in our relationship with our teenagers as well. So boundaries provide safety and respect. Let me give you a couple discussion questions. First of all, parents, what boundaries in your home have helped your teenagers to thrive? Big question. What boundaries have helped them? How do boundaries help? Number 2, teens, what are some rules your parents have for you that you don't entirely understand why? Well, Mom, Dad, I know that I'm not supposed to. I know that I have to do this or not do this, but can you explain to me why? And that would be a good discussion. Number 3, how does understanding the purpose of boundaries help you to obey them better? Oh, now I get it. Now I understand why that boundary is there. How does that help you in obeying that boundary? Just the communication alone. Okay? Number two, boundaries ought to be taught, not assumed. So we have to show people, and I've already referenced this in our first point, but we have to be very careful to say this is what the boundary is. We don't go beyond here. We don't watch that. We don't say this. We don't act like, what are your attitudinal boundaries? What are they? And we ought to teach them. Here's what it is, and here's why it is. Why? Because we just make assumptions that kids will know. We just make assumptions that because kids grow up in our family, you ought to know better. Well, the fact is we don't know better, and we need to be clearly taught. That's true of all of us. So, a couple thoughts that I want you to consider. And first of all, just explain the why. We've talked about this already. Some of this is reiterative, but explain the why. And that's going to help you, mom and dad. Because sometimes we have rules just because mom and dad had rules, and grandpa and grandpa. And bless God, that's the way I grew up. But culture changes and situations change, and we need to understand the why behind our what's. And the fact that we have to teach it to our kids really helps to underscore what our why is. So can you explain the why? They need to be able to explain that why one day, so you explain it to them. Number 2, model the boundary. I'm not saying that every rule you have for your kids is a rule that you as a mom or dad need to have for yourself, but many times that's the case. Parents need to have boundaries when it comes to their cell phone usage, when it comes to their screen time, when it comes to the things that they watch or say. That we need to put self-imposed boundaries upon ourselves. And I think it's good to celebrate, what is the space inside of which your family lives? What is your territory as a family? Here are things that we do as a family. Here are values that we have. Here's places we don't go. Here are things that we don't consider. Here are attitudes that we don't put up with. Why? Because this is the land that we live in. You teach your kids what to value, and then you model those values yourself. That is absolutely imperative. So explain the why, model the boundary, and then I would say, thirdly, talk about the horror stories. That's an important thing for a family, that you would bring up real life examples of what happens when people go beyond the boundary that is there for safety. That's all throughout the Bible. These people left the boundary and went to Moab. Look at what bad things happened. It's important. That's what happened to Elimelech, remember, and Mahlon and Chilion. And all throughout the Bible, remember Lot's wife. Remember what Paul said in 2 Timothy chapter 1 when he warned Timothy, Phygelus and Hermogenes, they've turned away from me. So he was careful to bring real life illustrations, people that Timothy knew, to say, Timothy, don't be like them. They went over the boundary. They didn't do what I expect of you, and look at what happened. So as families, we need to have those, because sometimes kids, they don't really understand the rule because they don't see it in real life. So explain that. Explain that with other families. Yes, their families allow this, but look at how that's working out for them. Look at that behavior pattern. Look at the trouble they got into. And don't be afraid to use real life examples, privately within your family unit. That's an important thing as well. Couple discussion questions. Parents, which boundaries have you modeled most consistently? Think about the list you made at the beginning of this conversation. That list, okay? Are you a good model of the things on that list? That's an important question. How about this, number 2, teens? How do you respond when your parent explains the reason behind a rule? I think sometimes because we so much want to do what everybody else is doing, or we want to be able to watch that, see that, do that, sometimes if we're not careful, we respond with an attitude like, that's stupid, that's dumb. How do you respond? Because that response tells me everything about your spiritual maturity. Okay, number 3, how does practicing boundaries in small ways prepare you for bigger responsibilities? If I can obey these rules that seem kind of dumb right now, that seem a little bit like, why do I have to still do this? Why do I have to go to bed at this time? My friends can, But what happens when we, with a good attitude, just fall in line? How does that prepare us for bigger responsibilities? I watched a compelling speech recently by a guy at a famous college. He was giving the valedictory address, and the title of his whole speech was Make Your Bed. And what he pointed out was that success in life really comes when we obey those little rules. We develop character in those little ways. That's what Jesus said. If we're faithful in little, we shall be rulers over much. That's an important concept. Number 3, boundaries ought to be reviewed and adjusted. So just because there's a boundary that we set for our kids at age 6 doesn't mean that that's going to be the boundary at age 16. I think about our own kids. We went to Pennsylvania when my oldest son was 5, and our youngest, our daughter, wasn't even born yet. She was born that year. And we moved into a little small house with a small fenced-in backyard, but it might as well have been a football arena because it was huge for us. For a little kid, that was our baseball stadium. That was our football stadium. That was our soccer field. That was everything. Looking back at it, it was a postage stamp-sized yard. It was so small. But for that age, it was the perfect size. And so it comes with rules. Just spiritual rules and expectations. The older kids get, if they're growing in grace or with a good attitude, we ought to be able to expand those borders. And so it is that we moved and went to bigger houses and had more space, and that's the way it ought to be spiritually as well. So a couple things to consider. First of all, when it comes to rules in your family, rules for your teenagers, have scheduled check-ins. So talk about it, revisit it. I hope that you have a family time. I hope that there is at least a couple times a week when you could all sit at the same table, eat the same meal, and engage in a conversation. At our house, when my kids were that age, you weren't allowed to leave the table. You weren't allowed to eat in the room with the television. You weren't allowed to be on your phone. Of course, we didn't have phones, but you know what I'm talking about. We had to be engaged in the conversation. And then in order to leave the table, you had to look at Dad and say, may I be excused? Now you might think that's a little bit overkill, but that's what we did. And we valued family time. We valued that conversation. And those were some of the most precious times that we had. So use some of those times in your family to have check-ins, to talk about it. Hey guys, what do you think? And what are some questions you have? And have an environment that's inviting where kids can ask those questions about you and you can revisit those whys behind those boundaries. Okay, so scheduled check-ins. Number 2, mutual feedback. Mutual feedback. You create a dialogue. And we talked about this last week with communication, but teens ought to be able to express concern, and parents ought to be able to have opportunity to clarify. It's an ongoing thing. And it's important that that conversation be ongoing. So mutual feedback is just so important. And then thirdly, graceful and responsible adjustments. So when do we make adjustments to boundaries? When is more freedom granted? When is more trust given? Well, a lot of times teens, what you're saying things like, well, Mom, I'm 15 now. Or I'm 16 years old. I ought to be able to. But understand that that's never a Bible reason for doing something. It's never, okay, I've achieved this age, I'm this old, so therefore I get this right. That's not the way it works. No, rather, the way you ought to look at it is, I am responsible in this way. So parents, don't give more freedom to kids based upon an age limit, like now you're 13, but give them more freedom based upon their ability to be responsible. That's what's much more important. It's much more important that you assess character. Anybody can turn 13 and everybody will. They just are healthy and live. They end up being that old. But how many of us know 13-year-olds that act like 7-year-olds? And I know some 13-year-olds that act much older than that because they're responsible. So learn to assess character, not just count years that somebody is old. Okay, number 4, boundaries protect relationships. And that's really the big thing I want to say. Boundaries protect relationships. The physical boundaries in the Bible were there for protection. That's why they were often immovable, like a river that's going to protect me from the enemy, or like a mountain range that's going to protect me, or an ocean. Oftentimes in the Bible, these were boundaries. But they were there to protect the relationship, to protect what was inside of them. And too often we look at walls, we look at boundaries as an inhibitor of our freedom. This is preventing me from something. And if you could get one thing from this lesson today, get this. That is, boundaries are not there to prevent you from enjoyment. They're there to protect your enjoyment. They're there to protect what's inside those boundaries so that what's inside can flourish. My grandfather was an avid gardener. He had a huge garden. But every year, he would spend a lot of time building this huge fence around his garden. Why? Because of the deer, because of the rabbits, because of other animals that would come in and eat. So he would spend all that time. Now, why? He did that so that what was inside would flourish, so that all of what's inside could have the best possible chance of being all that it could be. Big watermelons and squash and peas and whatever else he grew. How important that is for us as human beings to understand that same principle. Okay, couple thoughts here. First of all, celebrate what is inside. You know, when your mom or dad have boundaries for your cell phone usage or your curfew or what you can wear or what friends you can have or how long you're allowed to stay out or any of that, the stuff that bugs you, just understand this. We need to learn to see what we can celebrate. What is the boundary protecting? What they're saying is this is our identity as a family. And we need to celebrate what we have and who we are. If we just have rules for rules' sake, and there's no real relationship inside the boundary, there's no relationship between mom, dad, and children. There's no real family dynamic. There's no real family cohesiveness. Then the boundary is always going to look oppressive. Why? Because looking over the fence at what they have, looking over the fence at what they can do, looking over the fence at the relationships they have. And sometimes the reason why teens want to go beyond the boundary is because what's inside the boundary is not something we can celebrate and feel good about. And so really work on your family dynamic so that you can celebrate what's inside the boundary. Okay? Number 2, enforce calmly. We've talked about this already. When you have to enforce the breaking of a boundary or a rule, do it respectfully and calmly. And then thirdly, respect and honor the boundaries. And this really speaks to you teens. And that is, teens, your parents have to answer to God for you. And when they set boundaries, they're doing so in good faith. No one's going to get exactly right. No one's going to know the exact place where that fence should be. No one's going to know the exact place where that rule should be, unless the Bible specifically says, thou shalt or thou shalt not. So respect them. Respect them as those that love you, as those that will have to answer to God for you. And insofar that you can have a great spirit, have a great spirit. And respect and honor the boundaries that your parents set for you. which leads me to my last point. Let me just give you these discussion questions. I'll give you my last point. Parents, how do your boundaries protect your relationship with your teen? Does it? Are these boundaries because of the relationship you're forming and forging? Is this helping? Number two, what boundary feels unfair? Teen, what boundary in your life right now feels unfair? Why? How can you address that with your parents respectfully? Mom, Dad, I don't understand this. Why? Ask respectfully. Have that conversation. And then lastly, what happens to a relationship when boundaries are ignored? Maybe one of the reasons you feel so oppressed and you feel like the rules are, so many is because you are not trustworthy. And every time your parents turn around, you're breaking or overstepping one of the boundaries. That was one of the worst things you could do in the Bible, was to change a boundary, to remove a landmark. It was a form of stealing. So understand that sometimes the pressure we feel the oppression we feel is because we have violated the boundaries that were clearly set. So keep that in mind too. Lastly, and we've always ended with this point, and that is this: Christ models perfect boundaries. I love that. Jesus is always our great example. Think about the two times, at least in my thinking about Jesus' ministry, that he really got mad. He got angry. And both of them, I think, had to do with boundaries. One of them was when he drove out the money changers from the temple. Why? Because the people had overstepped the boundary. The boundary was, this temple is dedicated to God and to communicating with him and worshiping him and praying to him. And they had made it a den of thieves, a house of merchandise. And Jesus was angry that those boundaries had not been understood, the why, and had not been followed, the what. And so there was anger. But there's a second place where Jesus was really angry, and that is he was angry with the Pharisees. Now think about that. They were the rules keepers. They were the ones that came up with all these extra rules about everything. But what Jesus was angry about is that in all of their rules, they had forgotten the most important things, which were relationship with God and loving relationship with people. So their rules had taken the place of the relationship, so they couldn't celebrate what was inside those boundaries. So think about it. Jesus is the perfect example. He's an example of we need rules to protect us and protect what's inside so our priorities stay right. But rules themselves are not the answer. No, rules and boundaries and fences and borders are not the answer. No, they are there to provide a clear delineation, a clear place where we can celebrate our God and celebrate our relationship and celebrate what happens inside those boundaries. So here are my discussion questions. Number one, how did Jesus demonstrate loving boundaries in his interactions? Think about it. What are some examples that you could think of? Number two, in what ways can your family imitate Jesus in the setting and respecting of limits and boundaries? And then number three, how can you teach and enforce boundaries without crushing freedom? How can you have appropriate rules without having rules for everything so that you're crushing a teenager's spirit? Those are tough questions, but I trust that you'll wade through them, talk honestly about them, and understand the importance of boundaries. Thanks for listening in. We'll see you next time.